Now, this conference itself attests to the proposition that John Maynard Keynes did exert a major influence on the ideas and events of this century. Now, for me, this Keynesian difference carries a negative sign, because I retrospectively can predict an alternative history that might have been, a sequence of events that would be normatively superior to the history that we have experienced. Now, any such retrospective prediction is, of course, beyond the reach of any scientific falsification. Objectively measurable imputation of the effect of any person, whether that be negatively or positively valued, is an impossible exercise. Now, I've chosen my title, which is Keynesian Follies. I've chosen that title carefully. If you look in Webster's dictionary, you will find folly defined as, first, lack of good sense or of normal prudence, and second, inability or refusal to accept existing reality or to foresee inevitable consequences. Now, both of these definitions convey something of the policy stance that I associate with the term Keynesian. And I've put this plurally in my title in order to suggest that there are several separate and related elements involved, and also to hint that to an extent the whole historical episode has theatrical aspects of its own. Now, as someone mentioned yesterday, Keynes stated quite explicitly that the central purpose of the book, the half-century life of which we're celebrating with this conference, that the central purpose of the book was to change the perception of his fellow economists, that is, his peers among the academic scribblers. Now, in that statement, Keynes indicated his own respect for the influence of ideas on events, and he set out quite deliberately to modify the mindset of those whose chief business it is to impose intellectual order on a highly complex social process. And as we all know, he succeeded, perhaps beyond his wildest dreams. By the middle years of the 1940s, economists almost everywhere had become Keynesians in their conceptualization of the macroeconomy. They had quickly learned to look at the world through the Keynesian window. Perception of a reality is not, however, equivalent with reality itself, and the Keynesian follies find their source in the matching failures. Once having taken on the Keynesian mindset, the Keynesians proved to be notoriously reluctant to change their perception of macroeconomic and political reality, even in the face of accumulating empirical evidence throughout the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s. Keynes was the consummate artist, and his macroeconomic abstractions were comparable in boldness with those of his painter, poet, and composer peers in the world of high culture that he inhabited, in the Bloomsbury world. Because his acknowledged purpose is to change perception rather than to explain, the artist must acknowledge the existence of competing perceptions. Further, when perception is used instrumentally for a more ultimate purpose, as it was used by Keynes, among alternative perceptions of that which is. But while Keynes may be interpreted in this way as an artist, his economist peers were scientists, or thought they were. His work was not taken as offering a situationally constrained perception of economic reality appropriate to the 1930s, but it was interpreted as embodying a generalizable scientific paradigm. Now, neither Keynes nor any of his early disciples was aware of this fundamental difference that emerges naturally between the artist and the scientist. This theme, which is my theme for the whole paper, deserves further clarification. The scientist research program and any policy implications based on that program, is based squarely on a uniqueness postulate. That which is to be explained is the objective reality that exists, and this reality by its very objectification excludes alternatives. The scientist's research program yields hypotheses that may be falsified, and a sufficiently robust bundle of rejected hypotheses may lead at some point to a genuine revolution, the replacement of one research program by another, a shift in the hard core, to use the terminology introduced by Axel yesterday. And he referred quite appropriately to the physicists going out and settling their questions. At any moment, there exists for any scientist only one research program, only one hard core, one of a set of mutually exclusive alternatives. By contrast, the artist offers us a personal perception of reality, a perception that is not directly falsifiable. Even within the mind of the individual artist, there may exist alternative perception, several windows through which reality may be explained. I find myself using that Nietzsche metaphor more and more. As among several artists, a multiplicity of competing perceptions is necessarily acknowledged. Considered as an artist perception, the Keynesian model of the macroeconomy takes its place alongside alternative perceptions. It is neither true nor false, neither right nor wrong, since these are descriptive attributes that simply do not apply. The Keynesian perception offered original insights that may have been helpful in the interpretation of the macroeconomy of the 1930s. As many who knew him have suggested, the perception might well have been replaced by others in response to the shifts in the economic and political environment. The Keynesian Follies emerged only when the perception of Keynes as artist were falsely interpreted as a research program of Keynes as scientist. Now, in the sections that follow, I want to discuss several elements of this, what I call a scientistic ossification of the basic Keynesian perception. I want to discuss this in terms of several familiar topics, like matters of money, full employment, functional finance, fine-tuning, ordinary politics. And I hope to show that each of these separate areas of inquiry may be viewed in a somewhat different light in the context of this artist-scientist comparison that I have suggested here. So let me first take up matters of money. The Keynesian model that was presented to us in the general theory in 1936 was subjected to very early and continuing criticism on the grounds of its relegation of money and monetary institutions to secondary importance in the operation of the real macroeconomy. Now, in the interpretation that I have advanced here, Keynes may at least be partially defended from these charges. In earlier works, he had presented alternative perceptions of the workings of a macroeconomy that embodied a central role for money in the stabilization of the macro aggregates. The new book was deliberately different. It was a new canvas upon which was now placed a model aimed to draw attention to non-monetary relationships. So interpreted, the folly lies not in the initial Keynesian presentation of the alternative model, but in the scientistic inference that the model represented indeed a revolutionary switch between research programs. Now, admittedly, here my argument suffers a bit from the rhetoric of Keynes himself, since this rhetoric seems to have been explicitly intended to convey the mutual exclusiveness between the new model and the old. In any case, rhetoric or no, the scientific interpretation was placed on the effort. Keynes was read as having advanced the falsifiable hypotheses that money matters little if at all, an hypothesis that was clearly rejected by events as early as the middle 1940s. A more important implication for the political economy of policy was the shift of attention away from monetary institutions as the potential targets for change and for reform. Interpreted as advancing the hypothesis that money matters little, if at all, Keynesian economics tended to support an acquiescence in the sometimes jerry-built monetary regimes that were in existence in the 1930s. The rational constructivism of the Keynesians was directed toward alternative targets that were much less amenable to feasible reform. And let me just as a side comment say that I associate myself totally with Carl Brunner's reaction to Jeffrey Harcourt's comments yesterday, in which Jeffrey seemed to indicate that unless you supported the policy activism of the Keynesian models, you somehow were not passionately involved. Let me only mention one of my professors, Henry Simons, who totally rejected the Keynesian apparatus, and no one was more passionate in his aim toward reform than Henry Simons. But he rejected totally the Keynesian apparatus because of its neglect of the fundamental monetary institutions which required changing rather than acquiescence in those institutions. As I've noted, the inefficiency of money as a relevant macro-aggregative variable in the early Keynesianism was quickly recognized, and attempts were made to reckon with this apparent gap in the analysis. But the shift in perception had been so total that these attempts were almost universally carried out within the basic Keynesian framework of analysis, rather than in the form of substitution of an alternative perception of the macroeconomy. This emphasis on a single model of the macroeconomy was directly traceable to the scientistic mindset of both the Keynesian advocates and their opponents. There seemed to be little or no appreciation of the possible side-by-side existence of alternative models of economic process, each one of which might yield helpful insights, and each one of which might prove more or less appropriate in differing situations. The artist claims no monolithic legitimacy for his own perception. The scientist, by contrast, brands as heresy any perception that does not seem consistent with the prevailing research program. The whole mid-century history of economics and political economy might have been quite substantially different had economists proved more willing to tolerate the simultaneous existence of competing models of reality. Rather than money does matter and can be incorporated readily into the Keynesian research program, we might have had Keynesian real variable models in existence alongside non-Keynesian monetary theories of the business cycle. The disciplinary dominance of the Keynesian program, even as the relevance of money came to be incorporated within the models, this ensured the continued neglect of basic reform in monetary institutions or monetary regimes, a neglect that need not have occurred in the alternative competing program scenario that I have suggested. It seems, therefore, fully appropriate to label this institutional neglect as having resulted, at least in part, from Keynesian folly. Now let me go on to talk a little bit about full employment. As we know, Keynes is largely responsible for elevating employment to a position as an explicit objective for policy. As I've emphasized, Keynes sought to change the basic perception of the economic process. He sought to bring employment as such onto center stage as a variable subject to direct manipulation. He sought to overthrow the classical model of market equilibrium in which employment is determined only as an emergent result or consequence of the interaction among the demand and supply choices of many market participants. Once again, in this explicit consideration as a policy target, and thereby generating neglect of both monetary and market institutions, the Keynesian emphasis ensured the eventual stagnation that we experienced in the 1970s. The scenario might have been quite different if the Keynesian effort had been recognized for what it was rather than what it was not. The folly of full employment can perhaps best be discussed with reference to an early Chicago-based criticism of the theory of Keynesian macroeconomic policy. Initially attributed here to Charles Hardy, who was a Federal Reserve Bank economist, but taught to many of us by Henry Simons, the criticism could be summarized in the following way. If you consider a closed economy for purposes of simplicity, it can be characterized by any two of the following three conditions, but not all three simultaneously. You can have full employment of your labor force, you can have stability in the value of your monetary unit, and you can have non-competitive labor markets. You can pick out any two of those three you want, but you can't simultaneously have all three. There need be no inconsistency between the satisfaction of the first two desired conditions, that is, full employment and price level stability, if you have competitive labor markets. But until and unless competitive wage adjustments are observed, you must violate one of the other conditions. And concentration on full employment as a macroeconomic target must therefore ensure that you are likely to have inflation. That was, of course, an early recognition of what later became the Phillips curve type trade-off. Keynes himself would probably not have denied the elementary validity of that central Chicago proposition, interpreted as a set of mutually inconsistent equilibrium conditions. What Keynes argued was that the macroeconomy of the 1930s could not be and should not be perceived in terms of the classical market clearing research program which the Chicago proposition embodies. In this respect, the long continuing debate over whether the Keynesian analysis is an equilibrium or a disequilibrium theory may have missed the mark. The Keynesian analysis is an equilibrium theory, but it is one that is constrained in its temporal setting to the 1930s. That environment embodied an expectational chaos in which existing monetary arrangements seem to have lost all of their equilibrating pressures. The animal spirits were cautious to an extreme, and the simplistic model of a highly elastic aggregate supply function did indeed capture a feature of the economy that was. The economy that was in the 1930s, however, was not the economy that was in the 1940s and beyond. Hard evidence was available as early as 1946 to suggest that the supply function, after all, sloped upward. As with money, however, the Keynesian success had proved so sweeping that the accumulating supply-side evidence was incorporated within the aggregative Keynesian model of the macroeconomy as opposed to the restoration of a competing classical program. In terms of policy targeting, the Phillips curve trade-off of the late 1950s and the 1960s replaced the more naive full employment objective that had been advanced earlier. Only with the natural rate hypothesis developed in the late 1960s did most economists finally discard this basic hardcore of the Keynesian program. For the best part of 3 decades, therefore, economists tried to use a perception designed to isolate features of a macroeconomy in deflationary expectational chaos. They tried to use this perception to look at a macroeconomy in post-war boom. The supreme folly of the Keynesians was perhaps the genuinely held but arrogant opinion to the effect that the surge in employment and output was itself consequent on application of the Keynesian policy tools. Now let me talk a bit about functional finance. Now, the policy instrument that was used to generate employment and output expansion in the basic Keynesian blackboard construction, or in those hydraulic machines that were used with various colors of ink, colored water that was circulating around that Aber Lerner was displaying in this country and invented by Bill Phillips in London, the basic policy instrument used to generate employment and output expansion was government spending, the G in the simplified algebra. And as Carl told us yesterday, Keynes did not really emphasize this. This really came with the Keynesians rather than with Keynes himself. But in the Keynesian policy models, you get the expansion through shifting the G. An exogenous increase in government spending adds to aggregate demand and directly or indirectly creates new employment and additional output. But how can government spending be increased exogenously? Governments, like persons, must finance the spending somehow. And of course, there are three alternatives. They can either tax and secure revenues, they can create money, or they can borrow. In retrospect, looking at it from 1986 perspective, it's surprising to me anyway that any attention at all was devoted to the first of these, that is, devoted to financing aggregate spending expansion by taxation, to the macro aggregative effects of tax-financed instruments to rates of government outlay. Nonetheless, as we know, books as well as articles were devoted exclusively to analyses of balanced budget multipliers that attempted to compare the expansionary effects of incremental government spending on one side of the budget with the offsetting contractionary effects of incremental taxation on the other side. Given the level of expositional simplicity that was involved in these models, the commonly stated value of unity for the balanced budget multiplier cannot be criticized. What remains surprising, however, is the apparent failure of the economists who worked with those models to recognize that within the structure of the models necessary to generate the unit value result, there is no normative argument whatsoever for the levy of any positive taxes. In order to produce a value of unity for the balanced budget multiplier, the share of the tax dollar that would otherwise have gone into personal or corporate saving must represent a net drainage from the economy's spending stream. But the value of that multiplier could be increased several-fold by the simple expedient of spending without taxing. By a desire to increase the relative size of the governmental sector, quite apart from macro stabilization objectives. Some such motivation, combined with the underlying prediction that the macroeconomic objectives call for continuous expansion rather than contraction, may have been present. Once government spending was introduced as an instrument for the achievement of employment targets, attention was necessarily diverted from the allocative decision between the private and public sectors, which always must be somehow part of the collective choice process. But the center of attention of the whole Keynesian theory of economic policy was, of course, on unbalanced rather than on balanced budgets. From the outset, the emphasis was placed on the use of government spending to expand output and employment, with this spending financed from non-tax sources. The Keynesian approach to policy was and has continued to be associated with deficit financing. Formally, their models require that a budgetary regime involve both deficits and surpluses, but the underlying predictive thrust is on the need for employment and output expansion, and hence on budgetary deficits. The increase in government spending is to be financed by either money creation or by borrowing. Now, it's precisely at this point that I've been mystified by the Keynesian policy discourse, a mystification that has continued for 40 years and that's shared by all Chicago-trained economists of my generation. Why did the Keynesians, and why have the Keynesians, concentrated their policy analyses on the financing of spending by government borrowing rather than on the money issue alternative? Why has the textbook thrust of Keynesian policy embodied bond financing of either expanded spending rates or reduced tax rates? Note that the superiority of money issue to finance deficits does not depend in any way on the relevance or irrelevance of money as such. we can remain within the very simplest of the early Keynesian models, in which only rates of spending matter, and still conclude that money issue dominates government borrowing as a means of financing spending. This result follows so long as any share of the funds borrowed might have entered the spending stream. The money financing of budget deficits is superior even if attention is exclusively concentrated on the efficacy of the instruments in securing the employment and output objectives. Among many Keynesian economists, only Abel Lerner consistently recognized the distinction between money creation and borrowing as means of financing deficits. And Lerner's idealized regime of functional finance embodied compensatory budget adjustments, accompanied exclusively by the required issue or destruction of money, and hence neither net government borrowing nor net government debt retirement for macro stabilization. Had other Keynesian advocates followed Lerner in this respect, another Keynesian folly might have been avoided, because the subject matter need never have emerged as relevant to the macro policy debates. But instead, the Keynesian emphasis was placed on the debt financing of budget deficits, government borrowing, creation of public debt. As a result, somehow, Keynesians felt it obligatory to demonstrate that the creation of public debt, generally and apart from any particulars of macroeconomic policy, that public debt involved no temporal displacement of payment for public spending that is so financed. Further, the Keynesians felt obliged to argue that public borrowing is categorically different in effect from private borrowing. The network of intellectual analytical confusion in the elementary theory of public debt was the direct target of one of my first books, and I don't want to devote any space here to a repetition of old arguments. But the Keynesian intellectual fog, for that is what the whole discussion surely reflected, was motivated in part by the underlying purpose of securing widespread public and political acceptance of an activist fiscal policy regime. To convince the non-economist public to abandon the classical precepts of fiscal prudence, the Keynesians felt that they needed to show somehow that public debt did not matter, because after all, we owe it to ourselves. How simple it would have been to make the straightforward Lerner Keynesian argument to the effect that neither taxation nor borrowing is an appropriate means of financing deficits that are called for by an activist fiscal policy regime. The classical analysis of public debt could have remained in the filing cabinet labeled public finance orthodoxy. Now, the introduction of an activist fiscal policy regime of budgetary adjustment does require that the classical precepts of fiscal prudence be abandoned, and specifically that budgetary balance be dethroned as a central and overriding policy constraint. I'll discuss that a little later. But the activist regime of fiscal policy did not require any shift in the classical analysis of public debt, either positive or normative. Because of the widespread failure of economists to make the appropriate distinction between budgetary imbalance on the one hand and the means of financing such imbalance on the other, an unnecessary source of confusion, ambiguity, and argument was introduced. We can go a bit further in this speculation about the might-have-beens. If the Keynesians could have followed Lerner's lead in making the clear distinction between debt issue and money creation, the highly questionable research program initiated by Robert Barrow's 1974 paper, Our Government Bonds Net Wealth, could have been totally avoided. Following up Martin Bailey's earlier suggestion, Barrow sought to demonstrate the inefficacy of a fiscal policy shift from taxation to bond financing of governmental outlay. Now, this Barrow effort was directly stimulated by the claim of the Keynesians of the 1960s to the effect that the tax-to-bond shift was expansionary in the macroeconomic sense. Now, if the Keynesians should have adhered consistently to Lerner's norms for functional finance in their treatment of policy, there would have never been any cause for the Barrow-type reaction, at least in the same form that it took in the 1970s. Even the most zealot of the rational expectationists could scarcely make a counterclaim to a Keynesian argument that an unanticipated tax-to-money shift is expansionary. And on this point, I think I want to join forces with Jim Tobin and Axel and others, and I'm very much Keynesian on the side as opposed to the new classical macroeconomist or the rational expectationist. Now let me talk a bit about fine-tuning. And my discussion here can be brief, since this deficiency in the Keynesian theory of macroeconomic policy has been more widely recognized than any of the others. Indeed, the very concept of fine-tuning the economy through compensatory budgetary adjustment is antithetical to the initial thrust of the Keynesian model, as advanced by Keynes himself. In the macroeconomic environment of the 1930s, this model did yield useful insights, and policy implications may be gained from the modified perception of the economic reality that then existed. But the compensatory budgetary adjustments called for by that initial Keynesian perception, this reflected broad tuning, rough and ready, catch-all revolutionary shifts in any parameters deemed subject to immediate political control. Jeffrey Harcourt mentioned this yesterday. The folly lay with the post-Keynesians, who converted the broad strokes of the master here with the implied time-constrained shifts in budgetary flows into a highly sophisticated, if naive, analytical structure from which idealized budgetary adjustments were derived in apparent independence of any expectational setting. To have believed sincerely that budgetary fine-tuning, even in the absence of the political realities, which I'll discuss a bit in a minute, to have believed sincerely that budgetary fine-tuning would have been efficacious for stabilizing employment and output over possible swings of an ordinary business cycle seems in retrospect beyond the limits of academized isolation. Yet such was the state of the Keynesian intellectual epoch. Now let me talk about ordinary politics. The most significant folly that has been widely attributed to Keynes and the Keynesians involves the presumed neglect of the workings of ordinary politics and political institutions in the implementation of any activist stabilization policy, and notably any use of spending and taxing as instruments of that policy. In his biography, Harrod refers to the presuppositions of Harvey Road, which he defines as the attitude toward politics and government that was held by Keynes, who wrote the general theory in 1936. This attitude embodied a disregard for ordinary politics, based on a belief that Keynes' own powers of persuasion were indeed such as to ensure that any government would follow his lead, along with those of his economist peers, in any matter of policy. Now, this stance of Keynes can, on the one hand, be interpreted directly as a reflection of the isolated intellectual elitism that was characteristic of Cambridge early in this century. And there seems to be no question but that elements of such elitism were present. Keynes was no small d Democrat, despite his early philosophical liberalism. On the other hand, a somewhat more favorable interpretation may be placed on this characteristic of Keynes himself when we recognize that his work was aimed at changing the economic perception of his colleagues in extraordinary times, when the politics as well as the economics might have been expected to be non-usual and non-ordinary. We need only recall our own United States history in this respect. When Franklin Roosevelt assumed office in early 1933, the ordinary institutions of politics were in effect suspended. The checks and balances ceased to function. So extreme were the times. And politicians stood ready and willing to implement sweeping changes, almost without regard for consideration of permanent consequences, and with little apparent regard to the special interest of their constituencies. Keynes had not, of course, published his book by 1933, but he may have had something like this early New Deal setting in mind as an idealization, modified as appropriate for the political structure of his own country. If we interpret Keynes as the artist who sought to change perception with broad brush abstraction in the environmental parameters of depression, there need be no inference concerning the extension of the perception to the workings of the economy or the polity in ordinary times. Once again, this interpretation suggests that the folly lies with the Keynesians, who impose the scientific straitjacket too readily on Keynes's work, and who fail to sense that the word general in the title of the book should not have been understood to convey the notion of an unchanging economic and political environment. In any case, whether we attribute the folly here directly to Keynes or to the Keynesians who followed him, the record is here to be observed. Ordinary politics in democracy prevents implementation of the policy norms emerging from the Keynesian theory of macroeconomic management, independently of the analytical difficulties that I've already noted. That is to say, even if there should be no problems at all inherent in the Keynesian explanatory model, the attempt to stabilize the macroeconomy by compensatory budgetary adjustments would have failed. In ordinary times, political decision makers, ever responsive to constituency pressures, are driven by a natural proclivity to expand rates of spending and to reduce rates of taxation. The Keynesian policy model seemed to offer an intellectual and moral argument for expanded public spending financed by either debt or money. But ordinary politics fails almost totally when the other side of the Keynesian policy norms are required for macroeconomic purpose. Political decision makers cannot increase taxes merely to generate compensatory budgetary surpluses. Of public choice principles. And when people ask me what is public choice, I always cite that as the simplest of the principles that emerges. In this context, the net contribution of the whole Keynesian half-century must be evaluated negatively. It is represented best by the regime of massive and continuing budgetary deficits that we now observe. Deficits that bear no relationship to any alleged macroeconomic purpose, and that are almost universally acknowledged to have adverse consequences for the economy as well as for the moral bases of modern society. These deficits emerged because the Keynesian impact was to dislodge almost totally the precept of budget balance from a once effective fiscal constitution. Once the budget was introduced as an instrument for policy adjustment, there was no means of avoiding the non-Keynesian consequences. Even here, however, the negative impact would have been severely constrained if the Lerner norms should have been adopted. It seems unlikely to me that the irresponsibilities of the fiscal politics of the 1970s and 1980s could have been achieved by money financing of the deficits of the magnitudes we now observe. So let me now go to my conclusions. The Keynesian follies that I have discussed, matters of money, full employment, functional finance, fine-tuning, ordinary politics, these, of course, summarize very familiar criticisms of the whole Keynesian enterprise. What I've tried to do here is to incorporate these criticisms in an interpretation of the Keynesian effort that may offer an insight into the intellectual history of the half-century. My theme here is that Keynes was essentially an artist, offering others a new perception of the economic reality of his time, a perception that he may have deemed to be necessary to draw out inferences for the dramatic policy action that he felt governments should undertake. The economic reality need not have been presumed invariant over time, and in this respect, my interpretation is fully consistent with that of George Shackle, who has always called himself a Keynesian and who has emphasized always the subjective element in Keynes's vision. I was very pleased to hear Professor Preston mention George Shackle, and the fact that he mentioned George Shackle and Frank Knight in the same paragraph meant that I never could say anything negative about Professor Preston's presentation, because they're two of my great heroes. If he had added Knut Wicksell, I would have bowed in obeisance. But let me just quote from Shackle an interpretation of Keynes that I think I share and which sort of summarizes, I think, something close to my own position. This is a quotation from Shackle's book, The Years of High Theory. Keynes's whole theory of unemployment, is ultimately the simple statement that rational expectation being unattainable, we substitute for it first one and then another kind of irrational expectation. And the shift from one arbitrary basis to another gives us from time to time a moment of truth when an artificial confidence is for the time being dissolved and we as businessmen are afraid to invest and so fail to produce enough demand to match our society's desire to produce. Keynes's general theory attempted a rational theory of a field of conduct which by the nature of its terms could only be semi-rational. But sober economists, gravely upholding a faith in the calculability of human affairs, could not bring themselves to acknowledge that this could be his purpose. They sought to interpret the general theory as just one more manual of political arithmetic, unquote. I might say in passing that, in my view, George Shackle is the most neglected economist of our time, by some odds. The economic reality of the 1930s, characterized by expectational chaos, could not be understood properly modeled as if it were an economy in periods of expectational stability. Now, argument may of course be joined over whether or not Keynes, even if interpreted as I have suggested here, whether or not he failed to foresee the consequences of the widespread acceptance of his own time-constrained perception. Indeed, we may go so far as to suggest that the elementary folly of Keynes himself lay largely in his presumption of too much intellectual sophistication on the part of those whom he sought to convince, and or too much arrogance concerning his own powers of persuasion. But the Keynesian follies emerge, for the most part, from the failure of those who followed the master to sense the critical dependence of the whole perceptual apparatus on the presumption of fixity in the reality that was being perceived. Now, this is not the place for an extended treatment of the differences between the natural and the human sciences, or of the differences between the science of economic behavior on the one hand and the science of the macroeconomy on the other. The non-falsified propositions in economics are at best very few in number, only in part due to the familiar difficulty in setting up controlled experiments. As I've suggested in other places, men are like rats only in some aspect of their behavior, and to the extent they are not rat-like, their behavior is unpredictable. At best, imaginative economists whose interests transcend the boredom of rat maze experimentation can hope to isolate and abstract elements of uniformity in particularized expectational and institutional circumstances. And let me end with a simple question. In an economy that was characterized by an effectively operating commodity-based monetary standard, would the Keynesian enterprise have been a part of our intellectual history? It's related to the question that was raised yesterday by Les Thoreau. In my view, in an economy characterized by an effectively operating monetary regime, we would not have had the Great Depression, and of course we would not have had the whole Keynesian enterprise. Thank you.